Samara Blackthorne didn't mean to say it, but the truth was heavier than the secrets she carried. It was a plea raw and jagged, echoing in the narrow space between them. "Don't let me go." In-seok's hand, sculpted and steady, paused at the curve of her neck. His thumb brushed over the pulse point that betrayed her, his star-shaped tattoo a dark promise against the matte smoothness of his skin. He didn't force her closer. He didn't have to. He simply held her gaze with an intensity that felt like a physical weight, waiting for her to admit that her Black Widow mask had finally cracked. Samara's breath hitched. The corridor was too silent, filled only with the scent of his expensive cologne and the electric tension radiating from his lean frame. She could feel the heat of him, a sharp contrast to the cold isolation she had lived in for 3 years. He was a man who ruled through fear. She was a woman who had survived by it. They were a disaster in the making. "Tell me what you really want, Samara," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She should pull away. She should run back into the safety of her gilded cage. But she was tired of being a ghost. "Please," she whispered, her head tilting upward, eyes half lowered in surrender. "Don't let me go." Something shifted in In-seok's dark eyes. Something possessive, a predator finally claiming its prize. He leaned in until his lips hovered a fraction of an inch from hers. And for the first time since she'd ended her husband's life, Samara Blackthorne stopped pretending she wanted to be alone. 3 days earlier, Samara Blackthorne was a shadow moving through a room of light. The high-stakes charity gala was exactly the kind of place she hated, full of people who whispered Black Widow behind their champagne flutes while eyeing her inheritance. She played the part perfectly, polished, elegant, and untouchable. Her makeup was a shield, her luminous skin a distraction from the haunted look in her eyes. She was there to be seen, not to exist. She had wandered onto the darkened balcony to escape the suffocating heat of the ballroom. She expected solitude. Instead, she found the business of the Baek syndicate. Below the balcony, in the dimly lit garden, the silence was broken by a sound that made her blood run cold. A muffled plea, followed by the wet thud of a blow. Samara froze. She should have turned back. She should have walked away and kept her secrets safe. But the trauma of her past had left her with a reckless curiosity for the truth. She peered through the stone balustrade and saw him. "Welcome back to Soul Syndicate Stories. Thank you if you are just joining us. Before we continue, please subscribe to this channel, click the notification bell so you never miss any story, give thumbs up, and share with others. Tell me where you're watching from. It is always beautiful to see Soul Syndicate Stories family stretch across the world. Every one of your clicks, your comments, and every bit of love you show helps us to keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. Find a serene place to settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've probably never been before. Thanks for watching. Samara Blackthorne was a woman draped in the finest mourning silk money could buy. 3 years after Lucan's death, the public still treated her like a tragic masterpiece, an exhibit of grief locked away in a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Every morning, the sun would spill across the marble floors of her Seattle estate, illuminating the emptiness. She moved through the vast, silent rooms with a sensual calm that was entirely hollow, her deep, warm skin catching the light like burnished mahogany, though she felt like nothing more than a shadow flickering against the wall. Her life was a curated performance of luxury. She wore diamonds to dinner for one, read leather-bound books she had already memorized, and watched the fog roll off the sound until the world turned gray. She was the ghost of the Seattle elite, a woman whose husband had left her with a fortune and a reputation that kept everyone at arm's length. They called her the Black Widow in whispers, wondering if the grief was real or if she was simply admiring the architecture of the cage she had built for herself. The gala was supposed to be her re-entry into the world, or at least a temporary ceasefire with her solitude. She had spent hours preparing, her hair pulled back into a sophisticated knot that highlighted the soft, elegant lines of her face. Her makeup was a masterpiece of restraint, a soft sheen on her lips and lashes that seemed to go on forever. When she stepped into the ballroom, the air seemed to thin. She felt the eyes, the hushed voices, the weight of 1,000 assumptions. "Samara, you look radiant," a woman had lied, her eyes darting to Samara's throat as if looking for the marks of a widow's noose. Samara had offered a small, practiced smile, her lips slightly parted in a look of soft vulnerability that masked the screaming tension in her chest. By midnight, the champagne had turned bitter, and the music felt like nails against her skin. She needed to breathe. She needed to feel something other than the suffocating heat of artificial sympathy. She had slipped away, her evening gown whispering against the carpeted halls, until she found a secluded balcony overlooking the darkened gardens. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and damp earth. For a moment, she closed her eyes, tilting her head back to let the cold wind kiss her skin. Then she heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, just the sharp, metallic click of a safety being disengaged and the heavy, rhythmic thud of a body hitting the dirt. Samara's eyes flew open. She looked down through the shadows of the stone balustrade and saw the world she wasn't supposed to know existed. In the center of the garden, bathed in the pale, unforgiving light of a security lamp, stood Baek In-seok. Even from the balcony, his presence was overwhelming. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, his jawline so sharp it looked dangerous. He didn't look like a man in the middle of a struggle. He looked like a god deciding the fate of mortals. For men surrounded him, their faces twisted with a desperate, animalistic fear. In-seok didn't move until the first one lunged with a knife. What happened next was a blur of calculated violence. In-seok moved with the precision of a surgeon and the lethality of a predator. He didn't waste motion. A strike to a temple, a twist of an arm, a brutal knee to a chest. Within seconds, 3 men were on the ground, groaning in the shadows. The 4th man fell to his knees, his voice cracking as he begged for a mercy that didn't seem to exist in In-seok's world. In-seok merely adjusted his cufflink, his expression one of intense, quiet focus. Samara should have run. She should have screamed. But as she watched him, she felt a sudden, violent jolt to her system. The hollow space in her chest flared with heat. For the first time in 3 years, the ghost felt the blood rushing through her veins. As if sensing her gaze, In-seok looked up. His eyes, dark and devastating, locked onto hers. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide his face. He simply stared at her, leaning in slightly as if trying to memorize the silhouette of the woman who had just seen him at his worst. Samara's heart slammed against her ribs. She was terrified, yes, but she was also awake. And as he disappeared into the night, she knew the gilded cage had finally been broken. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a secluded waterfront cafe, but the warmth didn't reach the table in the far corner. Samara sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't tasted. She had spent the last 48 hours replaying the image of the man in the garden, the way the shadows had clung to his star-shaped tattoo, and the terrifying, magnetic stillness of his gaze. She had expected to be looking over her shoulder for a killer. She hadn't expected the elegant, cream-colored card that had appeared on her windshield the next morning, bearing only a time, a place, and a single name, In-seok. The bell above the door chimed, and the air in the room seemed to sharpen. Samara didn't need to look up to know he had arrived. The quiet chatter of the other patrons died down instinctively, a primal reaction to a predator entering the fold. Baek In-seok moved with a calculated, silent grace. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, his dark hair styled with a precision that bordered on lethal. As he slipped into the chair across from her, Samara felt the sheer gravity of his presence. His skin was matte and flawless, his jawline an angular sculpture that seemed to catch every shard of light in the room. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply leaned in, his eyes directed toward her face with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being dissected. Samara maintained her sensual calm, a mask she had perfected over years of surviving Lucan. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze half lowered, projecting a soft openness that hid the frantic drumming of her pulse. "You didn't call the police," In-seok said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, suggesting a quiet anticipation. "I didn't see the point," Samara replied, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "Men like you don't leave evidence for the police. And frankly, the men in that garden weren't there to plant flowers." A ghost of a smile touched In-seok's slightly parted lips. He didn't look away. He didn't even blink. His focus was absolute, a stark contrast to the shifting, nervous energy of the men she usually encountered. He looked at her not as a black widow or a grieving socialite, but as something far more dangerous, an equal. "You're very observant, Samara Blackthorne," he murmured, his posture closing the distance between them until she could see the sharp, geometric points of the tattoo on his neck. "Most people in your position would be running. They would be hiding behind their money and their lawyers. But you're sitting here, drinking cold tea, waiting for me to tell you why I let you live." I'm not most people, she whispered, her eyes meeting his fully for the first time. The luminous glow of her skin seemed to catch the light as she leaned forward, drawn into his orbit despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. And I think we both know I stopped running a long time ago. The tension between them was thick, a tangible cord of emotional gravity. In-seok's eyes narrowed slightly, studying the vulnerability in her expression. The way her lips were slightly parted, the trust she was feigning that was slowly becoming real. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers on the table. He didn't touch her, yet the air between their skin felt electric. The world thinks you're a fragile thing, Samara. A widow lost in the silk of her own mourning, In-seok said, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. But I saw you on that balcony. You weren't afraid of the blood. You were hungry for it. Samara felt a shiver race down her spine. He had seen through the silk, through the luxury, and straight into the dark, surviving heart of her. She should have pulled away. Instead, she felt herself tilting toward him, a moth drawn to a beautiful, freezing flame. And what about you, In-seok? She asked softly. Are you the monster they whisper about, or just the man who cleans up the messes they leave behind? He finally leaned back, the intensity shifting from a threat to a promise. I am whatever I need to be to keep what is mine. And right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and the ghosts of your past. The sanctuary of Samara's estate felt thinner after the meeting at the cafe. The marble walls no longer a fortress, but a transparent cage. She spent the afternoon drifting through the sun-drenched corridors, the phantom heat of In-seok's presence still clinging to her skin. He had seen the predator beneath her mourning silk, and for the first time in years, the Black Widow didn't feel like a lie she was telling the world. It felt like a prophecy he was helping her fulfill. The arrival of the mail was a mundane ritual that usually brought nothing but glossy magazines and invitations to events she would never attend. But today, tucked between a thick architectural digest and a bill for the estate's upkeep, was a plain manila envelope. There was no return address, no elegant calligraphy, just her name printed in block letters that looked like a jagged warning. Samara took it into her study, the room where Lucan used to hold court, a place still heavy with the scent of old leather and his lingering arrogance. She sat behind the mahogany desk and tore the seal. Her breath didn't just hitch, it died in her throat. It wasn't a letter. It was a single high-resolution photograph. The clinical lighting of an examiner's table washed out the warm tones of the skin she used to touch with trembling fear. It was Lucan, or what was left of him. The image captured the brutal reality of his autopsy. The Y incision, the cold, bluish hue of a man who had long since ceased to breathe. But it was the handwritten note scrawled across the bottom of the photo in red ink that made the room tilt. The widow didn't cry. Perhaps she was too busy counting the drops of digitalis. The photo slipped from her fingers, fluttering onto the desk like a dead bird. Samara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't just a threat. It was a dossier on her soul. Someone knew. Someone had looked past the suspicious heart failure on the official report and found the truth she had buried in the garden of her silence. A sudden, sharp knock at the front door echoed through the house, sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. Samara flinched, her eyes darting to the security monitors. The driveway was empty. The gates were closed. But the knocking continued, rhythmic, persistent, and entirely too close. She realized with a jolt of ice-cold clarity that she wasn't being watched from afar. She was being hunted in her own home. She scrambled to the window, pulling the heavy velvet curtain back just an inch. Standing on her porch was a man she didn't recognize. Not one of In-seok's polished soldiers, but something grittier, a shadow from the Biko faction. He wasn't trying to hide. He looked directly at the window, a slow, mocking grin spreading across his face as he held up a second envelope, identical to the one on her desk. He tapped the paper against the glass and disappeared into the shrubbery before she could even reach for the alarm. Samara backed away, her legs shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the desk for support. She looked back at the photo of Lucan. This was the game. They didn't want to kill her. Not yet. They wanted to strip her of the one thing that kept her safe, her anonymity. If this photo reached the authorities, her gilded life would end in a prison cell. In that moment of pure, blinding terror, she realized In-seok was the only person who had ever looked at her and seen a predator instead of a victim. And he was the only one who wouldn't be horrified by the blood on her hands. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number on the cream-colored card he had given her. She had tried to pull away from his world, but the ghosts of her past were faster. In-seok, she whispered when the line connected, her voice raw and breaking. They know. They're here. Stay where you are, Samara. His voice came back, a low, grounding baritone that cut through her panic like a blade. Don't move. I'm already at the gate. The gates of the Blackthorne estate had barely hummed shut behind them before Samara realized she was no longer the mistress of her own fate. The transition from her sprawling, silent mansion to In-seok's glass and steel fortress in the heart of the city happened in a blur of tinted windows and hushed, urgent commands. He hadn't asked her to come. He had simply reached into her life and pulled her out of the path of a storm she was no longer equipped to weather. In-seok's penthouse was a testament to the man himself. Cold, sprawling, and impossibly sharp. It occupied the top 2 floors of a skyscraper that looked down on the rest of Seattle like a king observing his subjects. The walls were mostly floor-to-ceiling glass, exposing the city's glittering veins of light. Yet the interior felt like a vault. You'll sleep here, In-seok said, his voice echoing off the polished obsidian floors as he led her into a bedroom that overlooked the sound. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his focus instead on a tablet held by one of his silent, suited men. My security team occupies the floor below. No one enters this building without my thumbprint. Not even the Biko faction. Samara stood in the center of the room, her small suitcase looking pathetic against the backdrop of such clinical perfection. She felt the sensual calm she usually projected beginning to fray at the edges. Here, under the glare of his world, she wasn't the powerful Black Widow. She was a liability. Is this a sanctuary or a cell? She asked softly, her eyes tracing the star-shaped tattoo on his neck as he finally turned toward her. In-seok dismissed his men with a sharp flick of his wrist. The door clicked shut, leaving them in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. He stepped into her space, his movements lithe and predatory. He didn't stop until he was mere inches away, his shadow falling over her like a dark shroud. The matte texture of his skin seemed to drink in the moonlight, and for a moment, Samara forgot how to breathe. It's whatever you need it to be to stay alive, he murmured, leaning in. The quiet intensity in his gaze was suffocating. He didn't touch her, yet she could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the chilled air of the penthouse. His thumb brushed the edge of his jawline, a gesture of anticipation that sent a shiver racing down her spine. I saw the photo, Samara. I know they aren't just looking for money. They want to tear you apart to get to me. And what do you want? She whispered, her head tilting upward instinctively. Her lips were slightly parted, her vulnerability laid bare in the private glow of the room. Why go through all this for a woman the world calls a murderer? In-seok's eyes darkened, a possessive flicker ignited in the depths of his pupils. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the curve of her shoulder, the heat of his palm nearly scorching her skin through the silk of her dress. Because the world is wrong about you, he said, his voice dropping to a low, velvet rasp. They think you're a monster because you survived. I think you're a masterpiece because you didn't break. And I don't let anyone destroy what belongs in my gallery. The word belongs hummed between them, heavy with 1,000 unspoken implications. Samara felt the walls of her heart, the ones she had built to keep the memory of Lucan out, trembling under the weight of In-seok's focus. She had tried to pull away from the shadows, but here, wrapped in his protection, she realized she was falling deeper into them. And the terrifying part wasn't the danger outside the glass. It was the way she wanted to step even closer to the man standing in front of her. I don't belong to anyone, she breathed, though her body betrayed her, leaning into the magnetic pull of his presence. Not yet, In-seok replied, his lips hovering a breath away from her forehead. But by the time this is over, you won't remember how to be anyone else's. The following nights in the penthouse were marked by a silence, so heavy it felt, as though the oxygen itself had been replaced by the weight of things unsaid. Samara moved through the obsidian-tiled halls like a beautiful, displaced spirit, her warm, deep skin glowing against the stark, clinical lines of In-seok's world. She was safe, yet she had never felt more exposed. It was past midnight when she found him on the terrace, the city below a shimmering carpet of electric blue and amber. He was seated in a low chair, his dark top discarded against the glass table, exposing the broad, powerful expanse of his shoulders. The cold air didn't seem to touch him. In the moonlight, the tattoo on the left side of his neck appeared to pulse, a sharp, geometric star that cascaded down toward his collarbone like a fragment of a fallen constellation. Samara approached with her signature sensual calm, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm. She stood behind him, her eyes tracing the jagged points of the ink. "I used to think it was just art," she whispered, her voice a soft thread in the wind. "Something to make you look like the rebel the world thinks you are." In-seok didn't turn, but his posture shifted, an invitation in the stillness. "It's not art," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "It's a tally." Samara's breath hitched as she stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she reached out. She didn't touch him. Not yet, but she could feel the heat radiating from his matte skin. "A tally of what?" "The points of the star represent the families I had to dismantle to sit in this chair," he murmured, finally turning his head to look at her. His jawline was a sculpted blade, his eyes dark and patient. The geometric lines between them are the blood spilled to connect the territories. "In my world, Samara, you don't inherit a throne. You build it out of the bones of the people who tried to stop you." The ruthlessness of his words should have sent her running back to the bedroom, but instead, she felt a magnetic pull. She saw the cost of his power in the tension of his frame, the deliberate, precise grooming that hit a man who had survived 1,000 wars. He was a monster, perhaps, but he was an honest one. "Does it ever stop?" she asked, her hand finally making contact with his shoulder. His skin was like silk over granite. She traced the edge of the tattoo, her touch light, vulnerable. "The killing? The building?" In-seok reached up, catching her hand in his. His grip was firm, possessive, yet he didn't pull her away. He guided her fingers until they rested directly over the center of the star. "It stops when there is no one left to challenge the mark, or when the mark is passed to someone else." He leaned in, his face inches from hers, the closeness conveying an emotional gravity that made her head swim. "You spent 3 years hiding what you did to Lucan. I spend every day wearing my sins for the world to see. Tell me, Samara, who is the more dangerous predator?" Samara looked into his eyes and saw her own reflection. A woman who was no longer just a black widow in mourning, but a survivor who recognized the fire in the man before her. She didn't pull away. She tilted her head upward, her lips slightly parted as she accepted the dark reality of his life. "The most dangerous one," she breathed, her voice breaking with a sudden raw honesty, "is the one who stops caring about the blood." In-seok's gaze darkened, his thumb grazing her pulse point. For a moment, the city below ceased to exist. There was only the star-shaped mark, the weight of their shared secrets, and the terrifying realization that she wasn't just under his protection. She was becoming part of his empire. The walls of the penthouse felt thicker the next morning. The glass providing a panoramic view of a world Samara was no longer permitted to touch. While In-seok was away, managing the fractured territories he had carved out of chaos, the atmosphere in the suite shifted. The air grew cold, stripped of the electric heat that usually radiated from his presence. Samara was in the library, her fingers tracing the spine of a book she wasn't reading, when the heavy obsidian door clicked open. It wasn't the rhythmic, confident stride of In-seok. It was the sharp, hurried pace of Junaseo, his second-in-command. A man whose loyalty was as precise as his grooming, and whose eyes had always viewed Samara as a smudge on a masterpiece. "Pack your things, Mrs. Blackthorne," Junaseo said, his voice a flat, clinical rasp. Samara turned slowly, her deep brown skin glowing in the soft light, though her eyes were sharp. She maintained her sensual calm, tilting her head slightly. In-seok didn't mention a departure. "In-seok is blinded by the star on his neck," Junaseo countered, stepping into the room. He was a man of shadows and logistics, and today, his expression was one of grim resolve. "The Biko faction hasn't just sent you photos, Samara. They've leaked your husband's real autopsy findings to a specialized task force. They're using you to topple the Baek syndicate. You aren't just a guest anymore. You're the poison that will kill us all." "He told me I was safe here," she whispered, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "You're safe from the street, not from the law," Junaseo said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a pair of restraints. He didn't look at her with malice, but with the cold efficiency of a man pruning a dying branch. "I've made a deal. If I hand you over to the authorities now, before the scandal breaks publicly, the focus remains on you, the grieving widow who took her husband's life. The syndicate remains in the shadows. I'm saving him from himself." Samara backed away, her hip hitting the edge of the mahogany desk. The vulnerability she usually feigned was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged fear. He'll kill you for this. He might, Junisio admitted, his jaw tightening. But he'll still have an empire to rule. That is the price of his throne. Now come quietly, or I will be forced to be less than a gentleman. He moved toward her, his hand reaching for her arm. For a moment, Samara saw the ghosts of her past. The men who had tried to cage her, the husband who had thought her a doll. She realized that pulling away wasn't enough. To survive in In-seok's world, she had to stop being the prey. As Junesio's fingers closed around her wrist, Samara didn't scream. She leaned into him, her lips slightly parted as if in surrender, luring him into the false security of her softness. When his guard dropped for a fraction of a second, she grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the desk and swung. The sound of glass shattering was deafening in the quiet room. Junisio stumbled back, clutching his temple as blood began to seep through his fingers, staining his crisp white collar. Samara didn't wait. She bolted for the door, her silk dress fluttering like a banner of war. She made it to the elevator foyer, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the doors remained locked. She was trapped in the clouds with a man who thought he was a savior and a boss who was nowhere to be found. You can't run, Samara. Junisio's voice echoed from the library, now fueled by a dark, simmering rage. The police are already in the lobby. There is no other way out. She pressed herself against the glass wall, looking down at the city she had once feared. She realized then that she didn't want the safety of the law or the luxury of her old life. She wanted the man with the star on his neck, and if she had to become a monster to reach him, she would. The elevators remained paralyzed, a mocking reflection of the city lights shimmering in the polished steel. Samara's breath was a jagged rhythm in the silence, her heart clawing at her ribs. Behind her, the heavy thud of Junyo's footsteps grew closer, punctuated by the metallic click of a weapon being readied. But it wasn't just Junesio. From the shadows of the secondary stairwell, two more figures emerged. Men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by the hollow darkness of their visors. These weren't police. They were the Biko assassins, the cleanup crew sent to ensure the Black Widow never made it to a witness stand. Samara backed away until her heels brushed the floor-to-ceiling glass. The drop was hundreds of feet of sheer terror, but the predators in the room were closer. She felt the sensual calm of her old life dissolve, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. She was no longer a ghost. She was a woman who had already killed one monster to survive. What were three more? Nowhere left to run, Samara, Junisio said, a streak of crimson staining the side of his face where she had struck him. He looked at the assassins, then back to her, his jaw set in a grim line of betrayal. It's over. Just come quietly. The assassins didn't wait for negotiation. They moved with the synchronized grace of wolves, closing the distance. Samara didn't scream. Instead, she let her knees buckle slightly, her head tilting upward in a display of practiced, trembling vulnerability. She lowered her eyes, her full lips parting as a soft, broken sob escaped her throat. She looked exactly like the victim they expected her to be, a shattered widow at the end of her rope. The lead assassin slowed his pace, his posture relaxing just a fraction as he reached for her shoulder. He saw a prize, not a threat. Please, she whispered, her voice a raw threat of desperation. I'll do whatever you want. As his hand closed around her arm, Samara's softness vanished. She used his own momentum, spinning into his guard with a speed that defied the elegance of her silk dress. She didn't just pull away, she struck. Her hand, balled into a precise fist, drove into the soft tissue of his throat. As he gasped for air, she grabbed the tactical knife sheathed at his vest. The blade was a silver flash in the moonlight. She drove it into the thigh of the second man before he could raise his weapon, her movements a blur of desperate, violent grace. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a survivor, and grief had made her reckless long ago. The second assassin fell with a guttural roar, and Samara scrambled back, the knife steady in her hand, her warm, luminous skin now smeared with a dark spray of red. She stood tall, the vulnerability replaced by a terrifying, luminous intensity. Junisio froze, his weapon raised but his finger hesitating on the trigger. He looked at the two professionals bleeding on the obsidian floor, then at the woman who looked like a dark angel of retribution. You're not a victim, Junisio breathed, the realization finally sinking in. In-seok was right. You're exactly like him. No, Samara said, her voice dropping to a low, velvet rasp that echoed the man she had come to love. I'm the one who survived him. And I'll survive you too. Before Jun In-seok could close the distance, the elevator chimes echoed through the foyer. A sharp, sudden sound of salvation. The doors slid open to reveal a silhouette carved from ice and fury. Baek In-seok stepped out, his dark eyes sweeping the room, taking in the blood, the blade in Samara's hand, and the betrayal in his second's eyes. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to drop, the air turning heavy with the weight of In-seok's presence. He didn't look at the fallen assassins. He looked only at Samara. I leave you for 3 hours, In-seok murmured, his voice a possessive hum as he stepped toward her, ignoring Jo's raised gun as if it were a toy. And you finally decide to show them who you really are. Samara let the knife clatter to the floor, her strength finally wavering as the adrenaline began to ebb. She tilted her head toward him, her eyes searching his. For the first time, she didn't want to pull away. She wanted to be claimed. The aftermath of the violence left a heavy, iron-scented silence hanging in the air of the penthouse. In-seok had handled the betrayal with a terrifying, surgical efficiency, leaving Jun In-seok to be dragged away by men who moved like shadows. Now, only the two of them remained, the city lights below mocking the wreckage of the night. Samara sat on the edge of the obsidian-colored sofa, her silk dress torn and stained, her warm skin still vibrating with the ghost of the adrenaline that had saved her life. In-seok stood by the glass wall, his dark silhouette cutting a jagged line against the Seattle skyline. He had cleaned the blood from his hands, but the intensity in his gaze remained sharp and focused. He didn't offer comfort, he offered reality. When he finally turned, he held a small, navy blue book in his hand, a passport, along with a thick envelope that crackled with the weight of untraceable currency. He walked toward her, his movements lithe and silent, and placed the items on the coffee table between them. The Biko faction is fractured, but they aren't gone, In-seok said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. And Jun In-seok was right about one thing. The police will be at your door by morning if you stay. I've arranged a private flight to Zurich. New name, new life, a clean slate where the Black Widow doesn't exist. You can finally be the ghost you've spent 3 years pretending to be. Samara looked at the passport. It was the escape she had prayed for since the night Lucan died. It was the chance to pull away from the shadows, to find a quiet corner of the world where no one knew her secrets. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the cool cover of the document. This was freedom. But as she looked at the passport, she felt a hollow ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her husband's memory. She looked up at In-seok, tracing the star-shaped tattoo on his neck, the mark of a man who didn't hide his sins. He was watching her with a quiet anticipation, his lips slightly parted, his eyes searching hers for a hint of the vulnerability he had first seen on the balcony. Is this what you want? She whispered, her voice raw and breaking. For me to disappear? In-seok stepped into her space, the heat radiating from him casting a spell that the cold glass of the penthouse couldn't break. He leaned in, his shadow falling over her like a dark promise. I want you to live, Samara, and staying with me is a death sentence. My world doesn't have room for sensual calm. It's built on blood and fire. If you stay, you aren't just a guest. You're a target. You'll never have a moment of peace again. Samara stood up, her head tilting upward to meet his gaze. She didn't reach for the passport. Instead, she reached for him, her palm resting against the matte smoothness of his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. I've had 3 years of peace, In-seok. It felt like being buried alive, she breathed, her eyes reflecting the luminous intensity of the city. I've spent my whole life being what other people needed me to be. The trophy wife, the grieving widow, the victim. Tonight, for the first time, I felt like the predator. And I didn't hate it. She took a step closer, closing the distance until their breaths mingled in the quiet room. The Black Widow wasn't a mask she wore anymore. It was the truth of who she had become. She realized she no longer wanted to pull away from the danger he represented. She wanted to own it. I'm done running, she said, her voice dropping to a low, possessive hum. I don't want a clean slate. I want to be by your side when you burn the rest of them down. In-seok's expression shifted, a dark, triumphant flicker igniting in his eyes. He reached out, his hand sliding behind her neck to tilt her face toward his thumb grazing her chin with a gentleness that made her soul ache. He didn't rush. He simply waited, giving her one last chance to choose the light. When she didn't move, he leaned in, his lips hovering an inch from hers. "Then the passport stays on the table," he murmured. "And the world better be ready for what we do next." The warehouse on the edge of the docks smelled of stagnant water and old gasoline, a graveyard for the city's secrets. Samara stood beside In-seok, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. The torn silk of her dress replaced by a sharp, tailored black coat that felt like a second skin. She felt the weight of the city's eyes on them, but she didn't lower her gaze. Her sensual calm had evolved into something harder, more crystalline. The composure of a woman who had looked into the abyss and realized she was the one staring back. Opposite them, the remains of the Biko faction and the leaders of the rival syndicates waited behind a row of industrial lights. Minjun, the man who had orchestrated the blackmail, stood in the center, a smirk playing on his lips as he held up the incriminating file of Lucan's death. "You're late, In-seok," Minjun called out, his voice echoing against the corrugated metal walls. "We were beginning to think the Black Widow had finally bitten you. Hand over the Northern Territories, or this photo goes to every news outlet in the country." In-seok didn't flinch. His jaw was a sculpted line of defiance, his eyes directed toward Minjun with a quiet, devastating intensity. "You've made a fatal mistake, Minjun," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. "You assumed she was my weakness. You assumed I was protecting her because she was fragile." Samara stepped forward, separating herself from In-seok's shadow. She tilted her head upward, her deep brown skin glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked at the men who thought they could break her with the memory of a dead man, and she felt nothing but a cold, radiant power. "You want to talk about Lucan?" Samara's voice was steady, a velvet blade cutting through the silence. "The man was a monster who thought he owned the world. I didn't just survive him. I outplayed him. And if you think a few clinical photos are enough to stop me, you've spent too much time in the dark." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the one In-seok had recovered from Junso's office. This drive contains the ledger of every transaction the Biko faction has made in the last decade. It shows the kickbacks, the betrayals, and the names of every man in this room who was planning to double-cross Minjun tonight. The room went deathly silent. The smirk vanished from Minjun's face as his own men began to look at one another with suspicion. The alliance he had built on blackmail crumbled in an instant, replaced by the very chaos In-seok ruled over. "This ends tonight," In-seok said, stepping up behind Samara. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch possessive and grounding. "The Black Widow doesn't run anymore. She rules." The confrontation didn't end in a hail of bullets, but in a systematic dismantling. In-seok's soldiers moved in from the shadows, disarming the rivals who were too busy staring at the drive in Samara's hand to fight back. Minjun was led away in silence, his empire erased by a woman he had underestimated. Later, back at the penthouse, the city of Seattle lay at their feet like a sparkling offering. In-seok turned to Samara, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. He reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her neck, right beside where his star-shaped tattoo caught the moonlight. "I offered you a way out," he whispered, his eyes dark with an emotional gravity that made her heart ache. "I offered you a clean slate." Samara leaned into his touch, her lips slightly parted as she looked at the man who had made her forever in a world of shadows. "A clean slate is for people who are afraid of the dark, In-seok. I'd rather be the one who owns it with you." He leaned in, his lips hovering an inch from hers. "Then you aren't just mine, Samara. You're the queen of the Baek syndicate. And this city will never forget your name." As he finally claimed her, Samara knew the Black Widow had stopped pulling away. She had finally found the place where she belonged, not as a captive, but as the woman who stood equal to the king. Thanks for watching. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story, please do well to subscribe, like, and share with others. Your support means so much more. Until we meet next time, believe in love, follow your heart, fight for what matters to you, and never give up on yourself. See you with the next story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories.